Hello there. I was talking to a friend the other day about job interviews, and she told me about the strangest question she'd ever been asked. The interviewer looked at her and said, "Tell me about the biggest mistake you've ever made at work, and how you made it even worse before you fixed it." She thought it was a trick question, but it turns out this company was actually looking for people who were good at making mistakes. And before you think I've lost my mind, let me explain why this is actually brilliant. So what's going on here? Well, there's a growing movement in the business world where companies are starting to value employees who aren't just good at getting things right, but who are also really good at getting things wrong in useful ways. And I know that sounds contradictory, but stick with me, because this is actually changing how we think about innovation and learning in the workplace. Let me start by telling you about a software company in California that made headlines a few years ago. They put out a job posting that said they were looking for a chief failure officer. Now, this wasn't someone whose job it was to fail at everything. It was someone whose job it was to help the company fail better, faster, and more productively. They wanted someone who could help them turn mistakes into learning opportunities. The person they hired for this position had an interesting background. She had worked at several startups that had failed completely, and instead of seeing this as a negative, the company saw it as incredibly valuable experience. She had learned firsthand what doesn't work, and more importantly, she had learned how to recognize when things are going wrong early enough to do something about it. This company's approach is based on a simple but powerful idea. In traditional business thinking, mistakes are seen as problems to be avoided. But in innovative industries, especially tech, mistakes are often the fastest way to learn what actually works. The key is learning how to make mistakes quickly, cheaply, and in ways that give you useful information. Think about it this way. If you're trying to develop a new product, you could spend months or even years planning and researching, trying to make sure everything is perfect before you launch. But by the time you finally release your product, the market might have changed, or your competitors might have gotten there first. Or worse, you might discover that all your planning was based on assumptions that were completely wrong. Alternatively, you could create a simple version of your product quickly, release it to a small group of users, and see what happens. Yes, there will probably be problems. Yes, some things won't work the way you expected. But you'll learn about these problems quickly when it's still easy and cheap to fix them. And you'll learn things about your users and your market that you never would have discovered through planning alone. This approach is sometimes called failing fast, and it's become really popular in certain industries. But here's the thing that many companies have discovered. Failing fast isn't just about being willing to make mistakes. It's about being good at making mistakes. It's about making the right kinds of mistakes, learning from them quickly, and using that knowledge to improve. And that's where these specialized employees come in. Some companies are realizing that they need people who are particularly skilled at this kind of productive failure. They need people who can design experiments that are likely to fail in informative ways. They need people who can recognize when a failure is teaching them something valuable versus when it's just a waste of time and money. Let me give you another example that really illustrates this concept. There's a pharmaceutical company that hired a team of scientists specifically because they had a track record of projects that didn't work out. Now, in the pharmaceutical industry, most research projects fail. It's just the nature of the business. But this company realized that some scientists were better than others at conducting failures that led to useful discoveries. One of the scientists they hired had worked on a drug that was supposed to treat heart disease. The drug didn't work for heart disease at all, but during the research process, they discovered it had some interesting effects on blood flow. That discovery eventually led to the development of a completely different drug that became very successful for treating a different condition. The company realized that this scientist wasn't just good at doing research. She was good at recognizing when her research was failing in ways that might be useful, and she was good at pivoting to explore those unexpected directions. These are specific skills that not all scientists have, even very good ones. Now, I should be clear about something. When companies talk about hiring people for their ability to make mistakes, they're not looking for people who are careless or incompetent. They're looking for people who are skilled at what we might call intelligent failure. This means failing in ways that are deliberate, controlled, and designed to produce useful information. There's actually a big difference between intelligent failure and regular failure. Regular failure usually happens because someone wasn't careful enough, didn't plan well enough, or didn't have the right skills. Intelligent failure happens when someone is trying something new and difficult, and they're prepared to learn from whatever happens, even if it doesn't work out the way they hoped. Companies that value intelligent failure are looking for people who can tell the difference between these two types of failure. They want people who can design experiments and projects that are likely to fail in informative ways, rather than just failing randomly. For example, if you're developing a new app, you might deliberately release a version that you know has some problems, but you want to see how users react to those specific problems. That's intelligent failure. You're failing on purpose in a controlled way to learn something specific. On the other hand, if you release an app that crashes constantly because you didn't test it properly, that's just regular failure. You're not learning anything useful. You're just creating problems. This distinction is really important because it helps explain why some companies are actively seeking out people with a history of productive failures. They're not looking for people who fail a lot. They're looking for people who fail well. Let me tell you about one more company that's taken this approach to an extreme. There's a consulting firm that specializes in helping other companies innovate, and they have a really unusual hiring process. Instead of asking candidates about their successes, they ask them to present their best failure. Not just any failure, but a failure that led to important learning or unexpected discoveries. Candidates have to explain not just what went wrong, but what they learned from it, how they applied that learning, and how they would design a similar experiment differently in the future. The company has found that people who can do this well are often their most valuable employees because they're skilled at the kind of experimentation and learning that drives innovation. But this approach isn't just about hiring. It's also about creating a culture where intelligent failure is valued and encouraged. And that's actually much harder than it sounds, because most of us have been trained from childhood to avoid mistakes and to see failure as something negative. Think about your own experience in school. When you got an answer wrong on a test, was that seen as a learning opportunity, or was it just seen as a mistake that lowered your grade? Most educational systems are designed to reward getting things right and punish getting things wrong. But in the real world, especially in innovative fields, some of the most valuable learning comes from getting things wrong in interesting ways. Companies that want to encourage intelligent failure have to work hard to change these ingrained attitudes. They have to create environments where people feel safe to experiment and fail, where failures are discussed openly and analyzed for what they can teach, and where people are rewarded for taking smart risks, even when those risks don't pay off. Some companies have created formal processes for this. They have regular failure parties, where teams present their most interesting failures and what they learned from them. They give awards for the most educational failures. They even have failure museums where they display products and projects that didn't work out, along with explanations of what was learned from each failure. One company I heard about has a policy that every employee has to fail at least once per quarter. Not fail at their job, but fail at something new they're trying. If someone goes a whole quarter without failing at anything, their manager sits down with them to ask why they're not taking enough risks or trying enough new things. This might sound extreme, but there's solid reasoning behind it. In rapidly changing industries, standing still is often more dangerous than moving forward and making mistakes. Companies that don't experiment and take risks often find themselves left behind by competitors who are willing to try new things, even if those new things don't always work out. But here's where it gets really interesting. The companies that have embraced this approach are finding that it changes not just how they handle failure, but how they think about success. When you're constantly experimenting and learning from failures, you start to see success not as a destination, but as part of an ongoing process of discovery and improvement. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works in practice. There's a tech company that develops mobile apps, and they have a really unusual approach to product development. Instead of spending months developing a perfect app and then launching it, they create what they call failure prototypes. These are very basic versions of app ideas that they know will have problems. They release these failure prototypes to small groups of users, not to make money, but to learn what doesn't work. They want to see how users react to different interface designs, what features confuse people, what causes the app to crash, and what makes people uninstall it immediately. Most of these failure prototypes never become real products, but the things they learn from these controlled failures inform all of their other development work. They've essentially turned failure into a research tool, and it's made their successful products much better because they've already learned from hundreds of ways that things can go wrong. This approach requires a completely different mindset about product development. Instead of trying to avoid failure, they're actively seeking it out, but in a controlled and educational way. And the people who are best at this kind of work are often people who have a lot of experience with failure, but who have learned how to extract value from those experiences. Now, you might be wondering whether this approach actually works. Does hiring people for their ability to make good mistakes actually lead to better business results? Well, the evidence seems to suggest that it does, at least in certain types of industries. Companies that have embraced this approach report faster innovation cycles, better products, and more creative solutions to problems. They also tend to be more adaptable when market conditions change, because they're already in the habit of experimenting and learning from what doesn't work. But there are also challenges. Creating a culture that values intelligent failure requires strong leadership and clear communication. Employees need to understand the difference between productive failure and careless failure. They need to feel safe to take risks without fear of being punished for honest mistakes. And managers need to be skilled at helping people learn from failures rather than just moving on to the next project. There's also the question of how to measure and reward this kind of work. Traditional performance metrics often focus on success rates and avoiding mistakes. But if you want to encourage intelligent failure, you need different metrics. You need ways to measure learning, adaptation, and the quality of experiments, not just their outcomes. Some companies have started tracking things like learning velocity, how quickly teams can run experiments and incorporate what they learn into their next attempts. Others measure the quality of failure analysis, how well teams can identify what went wrong and what they learned from it. This shift in thinking isn't just happening in tech companies. I've heard about hospitals that are encouraging doctors to discuss their mistakes openly so that everyone can learn from them. Architecture firms that celebrate designs that didn't work out because they led to important discoveries. Even schools that are starting to teach students how to fail productively rather than just how to avoid failure. The common thread in all of these examples is a recognition that in a rapidly changing world, the ability to learn quickly from mistakes is often more valuable than the ability to avoid mistakes entirely. This doesn't mean being careless or reckless. It means being thoughtful and strategic about how you approach uncertainty and risk. There's also an interesting psychological aspect to this trend. Research shows that people who are comfortable with failure and uncertainty are often more creative and innovative. They're willing to explore ideas that might not work out, which sometimes leads to breakthrough discoveries that more cautious people would never make. But learning to be comfortable with failure isn't easy for most people. We're naturally risk-averse, and we've been trained to see failure as something to avoid. Companies that want to hire and develop people who are good at intelligent failure often have to provide training and support to help people overcome these natural tendencies. Some companies use techniques borrowed from improvisational theater, where performers have to be comfortable with not knowing what's going to happen next and making things up as they go along. Others use simulation games, where people can practice making decisions under uncertainty without real-world consequences. The goal is to help people develop what psychologists call failure resilience, the ability to bounce back from setbacks quickly and use them as learning opportunities rather than letting them cause lasting damage to confidence or motivation. But perhaps the most important aspect of this trend is what it tells us about the changing nature of work itself. In a world where information is constantly changing, where new technologies emerge rapidly, and where market conditions can shift overnight, the ability to adapt and learn quickly is becoming more valuable than specialized knowledge or experience. This doesn't mean that expertise isn't important, but it does mean that the kind of expertise that's most valuable is often the ability to acquire new expertise quickly, rather than deep knowledge in any particular area. And one of the best ways to develop this kind of adaptive expertise is through experience with intelligent failure. When you've learned how to fail productively, you've essentially learned how to learn. You've developed the skills and mindset necessary to approach new challenges with confidence, even when you don't know exactly how things will turn out. So the next time you make a mistake at work, instead of just feeling bad about it, think about whether it might be the kind of mistake that a smart company would actually want to hire you for. What did you learn from it? How did you handle the uncertainty? What would you do differently next time? These might be exactly the kinds of experiences that make you valuable in the modern workplace. The trend of hiring people for their ability to make intelligent mistakes is really about recognizing that in our rapidly changing world, the ability to learn and adapt is often more valuable than the ability to avoid problems. It's about understanding that some of the most important discoveries come from exploring what doesn't work, not just what does. And that's a lesson that applies far beyond just hiring practices. It's about how we approach challenges in our personal lives, how we think about education and development, and how we prepare for an uncertain future. Sometimes the best way to move forward is to be willing to fail forward, learning as we go. Next time, we're going to explore another counterintuitive workplace trend that's challenging traditional thinking. We'll talk about why some companies are starting to hire their competitors' customers as employees, and what this tells us about the changing relationship between businesses and their markets. It's another story about how thinking differently about traditional boundaries can lead to unexpected advantages.